Welcome to the first lecture, which I've called Defining Globalization, and the first part of that is I called Many Perspectives. The second part will be on key concepts. Defining Globalization is the first section then of this course, and the first kind of perspective and the natural perspective is, of course, the globe. I have this association to the Hubble telescope. You may have heard about the Hubble telescope. It is a telescope that circles the Earth and is a satellite circling the Earth, and it has a telescope that can take pictures of space which are amazing. And nothing to do with this, but you should go and Google the Hubble telescope and look at some of those amazing pictures. Okay, this is my association. If we could have a telescope on a satellite that circled the globe and took pictures of the social and structures consisting of the globe and the cultural patterns, things like that, that would be quite amazing. It's not possible because social structures and cultural patterns doesn't exist in the same way as the universe. Now, we're not quite sure what the universe looks like, and maybe it has dark matter and things that we haven't really seen yet. The Hubble telescope has told us a lot of new things that we didn't know when we had to look at the space from Earth. But social structures and cultural patterns does not exist materially. They exist inside our minds. But they are so strong and so concrete in our minds that we act accordingly. And therefore, they are real enough. They're not material, but they are real enough. Now, the point here is that we want to kind of, in our mind, have a picture of the globe where our point of view is from outside and looking at the whole globe. If that is one way of looking at globalization. The first way, or not the first, but the one natural way of looking at the globe is, of course, the geography of the globe, and the social and you might add also natural science discipline of geography. Geography is both academic discipline describing the material conditions of the Earth, but also the social conditions, mostly related to space. And so geography is kind of one perspective on this. And when we talk about many perspectives, this is the point. What we see depends on where we see it from. Okay, let's move on to from geography to another perspective, the historical perspective. We'll come back to this shortly, but the discussion on globalization in the early 90s was had some critical voices to the sociological and geographical account of globalization being something completely new. If you come back to my favorite image here, the image of the globe and the images of globalization, one thing that we could illustrate at least is transport routes. And when you sit down in your plane seat and pick up the airline magazine, at the back of the magazines are always the map of how that airline covers the world. And so you see all these lines going from different airports to others, and it is a network. And if you put them all together, it's airlines do make up an incredible network, and is an important part of the globalization in that sense. But if you take the perspective of the historians and also others, one of those advocating this most strongly in the beginning of the 90s was an anthropologist called Jonathan Friedman. And those agreeing with him would say that maybe if you took made a map of the world with those networks of shipping lines, it wouldn't be by far that many, but at some point shipping lines started to cross the big oceans and connect the different parts of the world together. So actually the global, at least the global trade, but also the impacts on politics and on economic production in the different parts of the world were interconnected early on. And what the historians would say about this is that this globalization is a kind of the stage we have come to today of a development of a historical period that they would and we would call modernity. Now, I made let me see if you can see this properly, a timeline here from old times to the future, and trying to illustrate the main periods. And I should say, well, we can divide it into several periods. I have divided it kind of into two, one before and one after the French Revolution. And so modernity, when modernity started, it's not, I mean, history is written after the fact, so we can decide anything. I've suggested either 1455, 1492 or 1517. 1455 was when Gutenberg produced the famous Gutenberg Bible. It was we say historically the start of printing. And with the printing and the printed word to be duplicated like you can do with a printing press when you print books, the coverage of, or the spreading of knowledge, the spreading of information became immensely more effective, and it had the potential of reaching many more people than in the old way, where the handwritten scrolls and books that had been done by monks in the monasteries and so on, by the rabbis, the possibilities of the printed word was immense, and that possibility was taken into effect not in 1517, but 1517 was when Martin Luther started the Reformation of the Church. And so during the Reformation, I'm not quite sure, I do have his New Testament in German, but I don't remember exactly when it came out. But then he got the New Testament of the Bible printed and spread far beyond what the church or the clergy could control. And that made a huge difference, and it's one of the driving forces into modernity. The other one, of course, is 1492, when Columbus discovered America. Now, for Norwegians, that is a strange thing to say, since the Vikings had been there like 500 years earlier and found that, okay, let the people there stay in peace and we won't bother them. Columbus certainly did, and the Spanish and French and English and Portuguese and conquering of the Americas was part of, I mean, that was going west. They had already started going east and south, and that started the colonialization. So the colonies, well, it had been empires and colonies before that, but that was the start of making empires and colonization global. And so this all started several hundred years ago, 500 years ago or more. So is it a new thing? It's was also in the 17th century. The science was developed. It was a big change. We call it Enlightenment into the 18th century, and in 18 I've marked out Napoleon, and he was defeated. He was defeated in 1814, but then again in 1815 he was politically dead, but he wouldn't lay down. Napoleon, is his reign of France, started to organize the state in a new way, in a more bureaucratic way. But it was just a start, and it wasn't but he started something very important. And maybe we should, rather than the French Revolution, say that what Napoleon took out of the French Revolution and started to organize and systematize and make possible to think and to discuss, that was the real start of modernity. But it wouldn't have been possible if the kind of first, the Enlightenment and the period, these 300 years before that had laid the basis of that. So that's still 200 years ago. That's still quite a long period. So why is globalization new? It's not an exact answer to that, but to understand globalization and globalization as a phenomena, as a kind of new phenomena that we started to talk about in the 1990s and talked about for the last 20-25 years. That depends on I think that a lot of the patterns that we see and analyze in today's globalization was present through the colonization of the world, through the industrialization and division of labor in the world, and through the development of capitalism first and foremost, and on the market and on the economic side, and on the nation state on the political side, and the kind of the modern state, the bureaucratic state. All this has kind of as a development come together, and we may say that that is the start. That was the basis, and that is the start of globalization. And then it is a question if we would say, but at the over the last 20, 30, 40 years, development has kind of taken on a new pace and a magnitude that makes it different from this historical period. And there are some good arguments, I think, for saying that analytically. And we'll come back to that. But carry this with you, or bear this in mind. The global processes that we put into the phenomena of globalization, they have been going on for several hundred years.
Okay, let's sum up a bit of what we have been talking about. We have now been talking about the historical approach, or the historians, maybe we should say, approach, and we talked about the geographical approach and the geographical or geography pointing to the time and space compression. I hope I didn't confuse you when I had my little fantasy about the social science telescope circling the globe and kind of talked about space. When geography talks about space, it's space in the sense on the ground, the physical distances on the ground. What we are, the kind of the thought behind this is that the different structures, the different processes, the different systems that are global have an impact on health. We talk about health determinants, things that determine health, things that or structures, processes, systems that have an effect on the public health and people's health. And so it's not necessarily a causal effect, it's a connection, or sometimes a probability. The epidemiological statistics that we're going to talk about later, it's about the probability of a connection between these two. But we think of it as one being the cause of the other, but not a cause in the strict philosophy of science sense. Some of these structures, processes and systems are global, and so that's why we try to understand what is there something different about the global and about globalization than what is the case with national structures or local structures or processes and systems. And I mean, this is the hypothesis of it, that there is a difference. So let's go on to on the handout to more ways of looking at it, and this is just to point to how this theme and this field and global health as a field is built up by drawing on academic disciplines in the social sciences, all of them, but in different ways. They give different contributions, and so we talked about geography, we talked about history. They all have their take on globalization, and all of them started to work on it, some in the 80s, mostly in the 1990s. the kind of the most prominent was the economists and the academic discipline of economy, and the leading economists in the world talking that promoted the liberal or free trade mostly. We're going later to look at closer at what was happening within the global politics and relating to economy, and the free trade liberalization policy got stronger in the 80s, and so and into the 90s it was kind of a climate for it, and it was kind of the leading discipline promoting, but looking at and talking about globalization. But sociology was also engaged in this. It was a seminal work in sociology called the Network Society. I forgot by whom right now, but look it up. The Network Society, and so they looked at this new patterns of organization across borders, what followed socially by the new communication technology and about the new possibilities of relating, freed from space and time, or communicating independently of space in real time and so on. So sociologists looked at the social parts. Anthropologists, of course, also closely related to sociology, but also very much engaged with culture, found that this globalizing standardization that you would find, if you go to an airport, or most hotels, or a lot of hotels at least, or a shopping mall. If I go to a shopping mall here in Norway, the difference between that and a shopping mall in the US is the size mostly. But it's, or at least in all the European cities, it's the same shops, it's the same products that I can find there. So it's kind of this standardization, and what anthropologists saw many places, because anthropologists are on the ground and work locally, was that people didn't react directly to that, but they tried to also turn back to their roots and say, well, this is getting very much like everywhere else, but what's special with us? So the search for identity was strengthened, and that was kind of driven by globalization, and it's not significant things for global health in that sense, but phenomena like world music, like a lot of literature coming out of diaspora, things like that. That was cultural self-searching or searching for an identity, which also was linked to the phenomena of globalization. The discipline kind of in most trouble here is political science, because what political science had said and could for decades about international politics and about international institutions like the United Nations and so on, saw that through globalization these institutions and structured kind of deteriorated, or at least become much less important, and that governance really was challenged. It was a development and a phenomena driven by forces that could not be governed politically to any great extent. And that was fairly new, and international politics had been about that, had been about either international institutions regulating the governments, or governments coming together and kind of limiting the at least the bad sides, or the unwanted effects of some of the economic policies or even military policies. So that was kind of I don't think political science can to the same extent be seen as contributing enthusiastically to the phenomena of globalization. But of course, they write about it, and on my handout I mentioned Francis Fukuyama's The Origin of Political Order, or I told you to bear with me. The battery on my camera ran out when I was going to talk about Francis Fukuyama. And no wonder, it's quite energy demanding, it's heavy stuff. This is just the second volume of his book about political order, about the history of states, actually. I think the most significant contribution to political science the last couple of decades at least, maybe more. And it may illustrate the kind of challenge we have when we try to circle in globalization as a concept. Political science can be seen, they might protest, but as being in the old mindset of kind of seeing the world as local and national and maybe regional and then international, but not managing to pinpoint aspects, political aspects of the globalization process, political implications, of course. But when Fukuyama writes about globalization, and he doesn't do it very much, he points to global capitalism and the technological advances, and particularly the importance of modern technology substituting human labor, which has a big impact on many aspects. So to sum up the different perspectives, there is no either or. There are more or less insight gained by the concept of globalization. There would be in the different fields, in the different disciplines that we have mentioned. It would be, we can say that global processes or worldwide processes are not a new thing. That's been going on for millenniums. But there are a lot of new things that has come around the last 25 years. So many, and having so much impact that it makes sense to talk about a new phenomena. But then globalization would be an aspect of processes linking the different levels. So globalization is not, as I see it, a level above the international. It is something that happens on the local arena, but are more and more determined to some or impacted by processes that we can see are linked to a bigger area. Eriksen, that is our main book, he cites Manuel Castells, that I didn't remember before, that wrote the big sociological work. It's called The Information Age. The lectures that I'm going to have on this topic will reflect my view, and that for this topic is more relevant than in many other topics or connections, because there is no one answer to what globalization is, and the choices I make, the examples I select, the angle I use to explain something, that will to a greater extent reflect my me as a person than many other academic lectures that I would give. So you need to take that into consideration when you listen to what I have to say about this. Take into consideration first and foremost that I'm Norwegian. I view the world from a Norwegian perspective, and I live in Norway, I've grown up in Norway, I'm part of the Norwegian political and cultural system, and so that will color my take on globalization. Secondly, I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm kind of programmed to be more interested in the local processes, to understand globalization from below. That's not to say that I'm not interested or sometimes fascinated by the big picture, by the kind of, unfortunately not the satellite making pictures of the globe's social and cultural processes, but I am, but I'm kind of, so what does this mean for the local life, for the lives people live in local communities, because that's where we still live, but with some moderation to that, and we'll come back to that. I'm a skeptic. I don't think there makes any sense to be in favor or against globalization. Globalization, to me, is an analytic approach to what is going on. It had some ideological bearing, especially when it started in the 90s, and it was promoted mostly by economists and mostly connected to free trade and to kind of the liberalization of economics and markets, and they promised and prophesized that the end of poverty in our generation, and many believed them. I didn't believe them for a minute. I don't believe them now, and the voices are fewer. I'm quite horrified by the inequality that global capitalism has generated. It's maybe our second biggest problem in the world today. I'm unimpressed by the economic approach to a large extent. I think that economy has failed as a science, as a social science, big time, and much more than any of the other social sciences at the moment. I think a discipline that has had so great influence on big international political institutions and financial institutions that are regulating world markets, and being so capitally wrong as economists were before the crisis in 2008. I would have changed to something else. I think it's quite yeah. And I'm must be seen as a critic of global capitalism. I detested by the some of the results that global capitalism produce. That is not to say that I don't see that the general level of wealth has developed is a quality and aspect of development processes, and it is those development processes that we have to see. So something may be good, something may be negative in that sense, and we will look at that relating mostly to global health. But it is, may think of it as more or less, it's not either or, it's more or less, and more or less localization, in lack of a better word. It's the things that affect, that determine the things we do locally seem to be more global, more related to global processes happening outside our control, but also many places at the same time. And that's what we're going to look at in the next part of lecture 1.